In this episode, well...
Yeah!
So, if you watched the last episode, you know that we're on a frantic search for the source of our Supra's no-start issue. I have my suspicions that there's an issue with the crank position sensor or the crank trigger wheel, so I'm starting the tedious process of removing the entire front of our 2JZ. And before this process begins, we have to remove the radiator and everything connected to it.
That's the least mess I've made in the garage since I don't know when. That's a job well done. Alright, so here's our rod. It's seen some better days, but it's not too bad. I'll leave that outside so it doesn't drip all over the garage like everything else is doing. Now we got this big empty space, enough room to get to the crank pulley. So I'm gonna zip the crank pulley off. Oh, I gotta first take off the old serpentine accessory belt, and then might need a crank puller actually to get it off properly, but we'll see. So
I quickly realized that my impact gun was still too big to fit straight on the crank pulley bolt, and after destroying a couple swivel attachments, decided to yank the AC condenser out to make a little more room. Once that was out, the crank pulley bolt was a piece of cake and came loose with just a couple dugga-duggas. Then I grabbed my handy puller that I forgot to return to a Texas AutoZone 6 years ago and pulled the crank pulley off. That's when I realized I forgot to mark the timing belt. The car was already at top dead center, so all I needed to do was mark the timing belt and the cam gears. This marking helps ensure that the belt goes back on exactly how it came off, and we won't have any timing issues when we get the car started up. Then I began disassembling the front timing cover and all the associated bits that occupy the front of the motor. Then I took off the timing belt tensioner and pulled off the timing belt. Here you get a glimpse of the timing gear that's attached to the crankshaft and the crank trigger wheel. Upon inspection, the crank trigger wheel doesn't look broken, but it does have a tiny bit of play from side to side. The trigger wheel is pressed onto the back of the gear, so it's not really an issue, but I'm pulling it off anyway so I can get it welded to the timing gear and prevent any chance of it coming loose in the future. Next up, I'm unplugging the igniter and plugging in a laptop. AEM sent over a couple new things to try, so I'm following their instructions to a T to ensure that the ECU is actually healthy.
Okay guys, good news and bad news, I guess. So currently I have this little testing setup here with my multimeter, and I'm actually just checking. I'm taking a pin, like a hairpin, and putting it directly into the ECU on all of the coil signal outputs. and then I'm triggering them in the diagnostic software. So this is the same thing that we were doing before, but this time what I've done is, as you can see from this number, the coil dwell time I set like way up, like crazy high up. So instead of sending like a 50 millisecond signal, it's sending a 1.5 second signal. And a 1.5 second signal is enough for the multimeter to pick it up, if only just. And so if you look, I will trigger the signal, and you see you get 5 volts very quickly, and then nothing. So I tested this on all 6 coil outputs, and all 6 are outputting. So the problem isn't the ECU like we originally thought it was, and it's not the crank trigger wheel, which we also thought it was. So it's something in between, which I guess could mean wiring. I don't know. It's gonna take some noodling to figure out what this is. So I guess to the internet. But hey, at least we don't have to buy another ECU. That's always a good thing.
What up, y'all? We're gonna get the Supra running today. It's bright, it's sunny, it's 60 degrees out. Big Al just showed up. He brought an oscilloscope. We're gonna oscilloscope thing. So stay tuned. Alright, first things first, we've got to reassemble the front end of the motor. The newly welded timing gear and crank trigger combo goes on with a couple light taps from the mallet. Then, we put on the timing belt, and then the rest of the front cover. Then, a very eagle-eyed Mackie pointed something out.
Alright guys, see that little bolt hole? Well, that's supposed to have a ground on it. Which ground? The ground that goes to the igniter. Yeah. So that may have been the cause of all of the issues that we've been seeing for the last few episodes. So I'm gonna hook that up and then check for ground continuity again. Then me and Big Al are gonna grab the oscilloscope. We're gonna oscillate some scopes and make sure that all of our coils are outputting correctly. I'll load up the proper firmware. We'll do a couple tests and we'll see.
I very excitedly reattached the ground cable and then checked the igniter wiring for ground continuity.
As you can see, before we had a ton of resistance on our ground. Now, when we go to ground, perfect ground. Now we check the noise filter ground. Perfect ground. Stupid thing.
Now it was time to kick it into overdrive. I had to reassemble everything that was off the motor, and I was gonna do it fast. The possibility of hearing this monster fire up for the first time was getting me hella pumped, and I could hear the sound of lumpy cams and turbo whistle in my head. There was a lot to do though. I had to reinstall the AC condenser as well as rewire some of the radiator wiring. While I was wiring though, I heard the unmistakable sound of the fartiest straight 6 on the planet, an E46 M3, and I knew my buddy Manny had arrived. I started on wiring plugs for the radiator fans, and Manny went at replacing the spark plugs. Just like with the intercooler, these fans used to be hardwired in, so I'm installing plugs as it'll make life easier for anyone pulling the rad off in the future. Then, we reinstalled the rad and started hooking up the wiring and plumbing the water lines. Of course, then we got distracted with what an M3 would look like if it actually made some torque. Now, of course, that'll never happen, so we got back to work. And by work, I mean Manny convinced me that we needed to start cleaning the garage instead of working on the Supra, because there wasn't enough room in the garage or something. Judging from the comments though, I'd say a lot of you agree with him, so I begrudgingly listened. Of course, I got bored of cleaning and decided to get back to work on the car. Peter also showed up to help, so it was all hands on deck to get this bad boy fired up. With all the hardware bolted up, it was time to mess with the software. I removed the diagnostic firmware that was on the ECU and installed the standard firmware along with the Supra base map. Then I fiddled around with the basic settings and ensured that the fuel and ignition systems were set up properly and that the correct injector size was selected. After that, we did a final wiring check to make sure everything was hooked up properly, and then it was time to turn the key.
You don't have to push the clutch. You just turn the key.
Yeah! Oh, doesn't matter. It's a win. It's a win. It's a win. That's it, bro. That's it. We did it. But, of course, we needed to figure out why it wasn't staying on. Which I remembered was because we had disconnected the fuel pumps a while back. So, a trip to the trunk and a little bit of plugging later, and... Does this thing sound sweet, or what? We went around and checked for any leaks or other abnormalities. Then we made a little noise. And then we went around and checked again. To be honest, it was more admiring than checking, but I don't think anyone can fault us for that. After we amply smoked up the garage, Peter quieted the beast and then noticed another noise.
Just smoke it. What? Is that your ball bearing spinning away?
No way!
Oh yeah.
A fun fact of ball bearing turbos is that they spin and spin long after you turn off the motor. And it's really the small things like this that help ease the pain felt by your wallet. Afterwards, we celebrated by cleaning the garage. Yes, cleaning the garage after finishing a project, it's pretty much the most Albon thing you could do. But it's nice to have a proper space now, especially since we're going to start working on the Mini soon. But until then, it's time for the Supra to sleep in preparation for its upcoming date with the tuner.